Hello. Today I want to look a bit more deeply into the issue of Christian nationalism. And I guess specifically I want to understand how the people who are telling us we're a Christian nation are justifying that idea, right? Justifying that claim. Who are these people, by the way? So it's mostly our current government, evangelical Christians, the Heritage Foundation, and most of the Republican Party right now. So we need to understand a little bit about the origins of Christianity before we can really understand how we have evolved into this today. And Jesus wasn't really the first Christian, right? Jesus' teaching eventually inspired the Christian church, but Jesus didn't seem to come in order to create a church. So what do I mean by that? So Jesus' teaching was much more along the lines of drop everything and follow me because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So he was he basically led his followers to believe that the kingdom of heaven would be established, I guess, in Israel at that time, on the earth. And he wasn't teaching, actually, most of his life he was not teaching that required him to die. Right near the end, yes, he taught that he was basically going to die. But that was really right at the end of his life, when maybe it became obvious that his teachings were being rejected by the majority of the nation, and he was causing a lot of trouble with his teaching. So therefore he probably accepted that he would have to go the way of the cross instead of creating a kingdom of heaven on earth. Whatever his original intention, I don't want to go into that right now. But certainly he gave his followers the impression that the kingdom of heaven would be established on earth, and that it was more important to follow him than to follow like traditional customs, like you shouldn't be following your own mother and brothers, you should be following me, right? So basically, when he died, then this created a huge dilemma for the apostles and the people who had followed him, and for his mother and Mary Magdalene, so the women also. And so essentially, without the resurrection, whatever form you think that happened, then Christianity would have died right there, or Jesus' teaching would have died right there. So Jesus came back to them, and I don't want to go into in what form or anything at this point, but his disciples believed that he had risen from the dead, he had overcome death. So that was what they went out teaching to the rest of the world. And so after a while, it became clear that it was more important to institutionalize the teaching than to just keep teaching, right? So this is because Jesus had left them with the impression that he would return within the lifetime of some of the apostles, that he was going to come back to earth and establish the kingdom of heaven. But 50, 60 years later, he still hadn't come back, and most of the people who followed him would have been dead or dying at least. So then after about 70 AD, 60, 70 AD, then people started to write down what they understood. So the Gospels were written from about 60 AD onwards. And actually, Jesus had been teaching in a Jewish nation, but that nation had been occupied by the Romans, and the Romans destroyed the temple of the Jews from about, I think it was about 73 AD. So then it became very, very important to write down the teachings of Jesus. Initially, Christianity was seen as a sect, or the Christians were seen as a sect within Judaism, actually. But as time went on, then the teaching spread way out beyond that, the nation of Israel. So institutionalization becomes the most important thing, and this actually determines what gets taught by the Christian church. And so anybody who has a dissenting view of what Jesus's teachings mean, or actually it turns out even like a different insight into what the church is teaching, then they are declared as heretics. So this is the reason why most Gnostic teachings were declared heretical, because Gnosticism, it didn't contradict what Jesus taught, but most Gnostics thought there was something deeper within Jesus's teaching other than what the Christian church was trying to teach, or the early church, which wasn't really yet formalized so much as a church. But initially there were bishops who had gone out to other nations, or bishops from other nations. So the Gnostics thought that there's, some deeper mystery behind Jesus's teaching. That, for instance, instead of taking the story of the fall of man, Adam and Eve and the serpent, as a literal event, then they interpret it as symbolic, symbolizing something deeper than that. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe there's not so much wrong with people seeking for deeper insight into the stories and the teachings and so on. But it doesn't help with institutionalization, because people who were seeking something deeper at that point were just basically a threat to the nascent church. And then, of course, at some point, the church, the Roman emperors accept Christianity, and now you have the secular authorities and the religious authorities, which is bishops and so on, they join together, right, within Christianity. So now the problem with declaring the Gnostic texts as heretical, or the Gnostics as heretical, it's not a problem at first, except of course that you're losing a lot of people from the church. But the early Christians, the bishops, were mostly concerned with making the teaching simple enough that most people could handle it, like making the demands of being a Christian not too onerous. So, for instance, you had to be baptized and so on. The sacraments, you had to follow the sacraments. But the Gnostics thought that this was very elementary, that was just sort of the beginning of your spiritual life. And so that's how the Orthodox Church became established. That's how Orthodox Christianity became established, by essentially declaring that the deeper seekers were wrong. They were heretical. Okay, so let's go forward now. There's no problem until, I guess, the Reformation. Now you've got Protestants and Catholics, and this essentially took place in Europe, and there was a huge amount of bloodshed between the two. So it's all based on what do you believe, on beliefs. And so then the nation of America appears somewhat later, with the Declaration of Independence. And then this is how the current people who claim that we're Christian nationalists are justifying this claim, because they look at the Declaration of Independence, which essentially claimed that due to the laws of nature and nature's God, then it was right for a people to have independence, to choose to govern themselves, as long as they essentially, made a list of all the stuff that the British king was doing wrong, that was unjust. And they could choose their own government. They could be their own government. That's fine. Okay. I agree. with that totally. But here is the point. The laws of nature and nature's God are what justify, essentially, the idea that the secular authorities and the religious authorities are joined together, right? So let me just read, actually. By looking to the laws of nature, or laws of reason and nature's God, as the ultimate justification for their revolution, the founders were asserting that there was an objective moral order in the world because that world was created by a benevolent and reasonable God. Since our minds are a gift from God and He intended us to use them, we can perceive much of the moral order through our rational faculties. I'll put a link to the origin of that, where that came from, at the bottom of this video. But now this is where we get a little off the wall, in my opinion. So the natural moral order exists outside of our will. It exists whether we like it or not. We are born into both a physical and a moral world that we do not create. Today's leftists think they can alter human nature. For example, by allowing children to choose gender reassignment surgery. But this will never work and will never lead to true happiness because we cannot change our nature. Okay, so now this is the problem, because the idea is that our nature is fixed and it's in accordance with how God created us. And God created us through the laws of reason. Okay, and God's laws are fixed and unchanging from this point of view. Okay, so whoever wrote this paper, this from which I just read a small excerpt to you, is claiming that God's laws and the laws of nature are fixed and unchanging and will never change, and therefore leftists, which is where the real problem comes in, because it makes it totally political, right? The leftists are condemned because obviously gender reassignment is not acceptable within the laws of nature, which are the laws of God. But he seems to be unaware that the laws of nature and the laws of God, as proclaimed by the founders, have been radically changed by scientific discoveries. Right? So the laws of nature and nature's God, as understood by the founders, were essentially Newton's laws. But Newton's laws were appropriate for a machine. They were linear. They only applied at low energies. And as soon as you start going faster, it's closer to the speed of light, as soon as you get into much higher energies, then we see that the laws of nature are just simply a low energy approximation, as understood, the laws of nature as understood by Newton. Okay? So the laws of nature as understood by Einstein are quite different. The laws of nature as understood in quantum physics are quite different. Now, it doesn't mean that Newton's laws were wrong. It just means that they were only applicable at sort of the speed at which we used to live our lives. But now we live our lives differently. Now we are talking about quantum computers. Now so much of what we do today is based on the laws of quantum physics, or Einstein's laws, relativity. So we can't ignore that. And therefore, when we talk about, the laws of nature as justifying the moral order of America is based on the moral order of God, which is based on the laws of nature, which are unchanging, we're already contradicting ourselves. We know that's not true. Okay? So now I'm not going to say anything about gender reassignment surgery. That's not my point. My point is that we can't justify the idea that the morals of America are the same as Christian morals, therefore we are a Christian nation. We can't justify that by referring to the laws of nature as being eternal and unchanging. God apparently is not eternal and unchanging if we are looking at the laws of nature as understood by science. Now, as a Christian nation, are we just going to overthrow all of the laws of science from the last 100 years? I think they'd be open to that, actually. It does seem like our government wouldn't actually mind doing that, although they'd be devastated to be without some of the results of these changes in the laws of nature. But anyway, we are in a situation where the way we justify being a Christian nation is not possible anymore. It's not justifiable anymore. So obviously philosophers understand this point. A lot of religious people understand this point. If we want, for instance, to look back around about the time that quantum physics was coming into existence, then there was also a theological development, actually a philosophical development called process philosophy. But that has been understood as the basis for process theology by John Cobb and David Ray Griffin. I've probably talked to you about this before. And these essentially, this is a theology that really questions whether God is unchanging and passionless. Right? Passionless means that God is not affected by what happens to humans, but that God actually feels everything. Also, the idea that God is a controlling power. This philosophy, which is based on a much deeper understanding of science, because it was essentially based on Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy, and he was a mathematician and a scientist as well as being a philosopher. His ideas have permeated through much of the world and through a lot of Christianity. They are changing the way that we think. Even Judaism actually understood humans as co-creators with God. We are not here here to just obey the rules of God, the moral laws of God, which is what the Christian nationalism is based on. The moral laws of the Bible and the moral laws of humans are the same. So there's no problem. So we're a Christian nation. Okay, not true. You can't thereby condemn half the population, which is somewhat leftist. And I'm not saying that all leftists agree with gender reassignment surgery or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you can't condemn people based on the idea that our morality is the same as God's morality, so there's no problem. And even like process theology, which many people like a lot, even goes so far as to claim that God may be partly female. Actually, no, it claims that God is equally male and female. And we all know that every human has both masculine and feminine traits. We are all in our nature have both masculine characteristics and feminine characteristics. So today there's a lot of movement within Christianity to understand much more deeply about the nature of God. Radically speaking, too, there's also a movement within Christianity to look back at Gnosticism. Why? Because in the past we didn't have the Gnostic texts. We were just told it was all heresy. But now that we have access to the actual writings of the Gnostics, which were found during the last century in several places, like most of all, I guess, in Nag Hammadi, where a lot of the Gospels that were left out of the Bible were found. They'd been hidden, right, at the time of when it became clear that Christianity was only going to accept certain writings into the Bible, and the others they were rejecting. So a lot of those rejected writings were hidden, buried, and recently discovered. And then we can find the Gospel of Mary. Mary Magdalene apparently had a much greater role in Jesus's life than was thought by Orthodox Christianity, who essentially rejected her as a prostitute. Nobody believes that anymore, at least nobody who has actually examined the Gospels and examined the writings that have been discovered would believe that today. Okay, well, there's much more to say, but I've said enough for now. Okay, thank you.